Hi, I'm Mick Davie, your iFit guide, and today we're on the Aegean coast of Turkey, and we're going to explore the ruins of the ancient city of Ephesus. Now, before you think, oh no, boring ruins, have a quick listen to this. On our walk today, we'll walk through what was once the greatest shopping mall on earth. We'll take a quick detour through a very public Roman bathroom and make our way through one of history's most important libraries, which was linked by a secret tunnel to a brothel. And then we'll move onwards to the magnificent Great Theatre, where sopranos sang like angels and gladiators fought to the death. I hope that sounds like fun. It will be. So let's get you and your machine warmed up for a stroll through a day in the life of Ephesus. This is a little bit unexpected. There's an army walking towards us. This place was overrun over the centuries by many different armies, and these guys look like they mean business. Look at this. That's breathtaking. So let me just begin by saying that what's so extraordinary about Ephesus is that, like so many other ancient sites where you can sort of barely discern what life was like, the ruins here are so well preserved, and there are so many of them, that you can really get a feel for the way people lived their lives. This is a city of stories. History's alive here. Now, this area was first settled around 1000 BC, and according to legend, the city was founded by a Greek prince named Androclos. The oracle at Delphi proclaimed that a wild boar would lead Androclos to exactly the spot where the city should be built. Then, by 500 BC, Ephesus was a bustling seaport and famous as the worship center for the goddess Artemis, and pilgrims flocked from all over the Mediterranean to pray at her temple, which was considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. The Ephesian culture inspired the Golden Age in Greece, which is just across the Mediterranean over there, and produced philosophers such as Heraclitus, who famously said, "The only constant is change." And he was right. Over the centuries, the Lydians, Athenians, the Persians, Alexander the Great, and the Romans overran Ephesus. At its peak, around 100 AD, Ephesus was one of the grandest cities of the ancient world, with a staggering population of 250,000 residents. It was the second biggest city in the Roman Empire, and it was exceeded only by Rome itself. It had temples, baths, palaces. Toga-clad crowds streamed along these thoroughfares. There were banks, shops, bars. There was even street lighting. Ephesus was ostentatious. It was glorious, posh. And today, these roads are abandoned, and they have wildflowers growing up between the flagstones and sprawling headless columns and statues. But among these are the remnants of some of the most remarkable Roman structures in the world. And we're about to see some of the very best. So over here, we have the original Odeon Theatre. If you've ever been to England, there's a chain of cinemas there called the Odeons, and they got the name from this one. This was built around 150 AD, and the Odeon was once topped by a grand wooden roof, and it seated about 1,500 people. Compared to the Grand Theatre, which we will see a little later in our walk, this was an intimate space for theatre, plays, and concerts. Come up here and take a look at what a beautiful structure this was. You can imagine it with a roof above, toga-clad Romans, eating their peanuts, drinking their water, and watching a lovely play. But this wasn't only used for theatre. This was also where the Ephesus City Council met. Every Thursday morning, 450 aristocrats would hash out the civic business of the city right here. And some of these lower marble seats actually had armrests and footrests. And if we pop down here, we can see the very faint outlines in some of these areas of carved lion's paws and other ornamentations. And by the way, to get a sense of just how much excavation had to take place to unearth the theatre, when this area was rediscovered, it was buried in dirt all the way up to those top seats. Let's head down this way. You have to sort of imagine what this would have been like. Marble-covered streets, these beautiful columns on either side of the street. This gorgeous view of the mountains. Must have been such a beautiful city. Now, these Doric columns over here mark the entrance to the ruined Prytaneum, which was one of the most important civic structures in Ephesus. This was a kind of combination temple and town hall, a meeting point for 6 high officials who were both priests and civic administrators. And this was where the city's sacred flame was kept. Just as Rome had its eternal flame tended to by virgins, the curates of Ephesus made sure this fire always flickered. It was never allowed to go out. And citizens believed that as long as the fire was alive, Ephesus would prosper. So come and take a look at the surface of the street down here. I find this really interesting. You'll see these circular depressions and these linear grooves gouged into the marble. And they were made to keep pedestrians from slipping on the slick surface of the road. This was important not only during the winter rains, but also during the searing summer heat, because shopkeepers would regularly douse these streets with water from the fountains to cool them down, which made the streets super slippery. So the little depressions and grooves kept people from taking a tumble when they went shopping. So this is called the Curate's Way, and it was the main thoroughfare through Ephesus. It was 650 feet long and lined with statutory, civic and religious buildings and shops selling incense, gold and other goods that had been carried here to the end of the Silk Road. And walking down this street is really the best way to understand Ephesian daily life. This road gives you a sense of the scale of Ephesus at its peak. And if you can mentally replace the tourists in shorts with Romans in togas, and imagine life in this bustling seaport city, bubbling fountains, flowering trees, archways, old men playing backgammon in the shade. And this over here actually is one of the most interesting buildings on this street. It's called the Trajan Fountain, and it was once dominated by a huge statue that stood under that archway there of the great soldier Emperor Trajan, grasping a pennant and standing on a globe. The inscription reads, "I have conquered it all, and it's now under my foot." I think we can assume he was an egomaniac, and today only the globe and a single foot nearby survive. And the fountain's water spilled under the statue to clean and cool the streets of the Curate's Way. And speaking of fountains, they served a practical purpose here in Ephesus, supplying people with fresh water. But the fountains were also a symbol of the city's immense wealth. Ephesians were proud of the fact that they could waste water, and they let it cascade endlessly and often unplugged the fountains to let the water run into the streets and cool the city down on hot days. Over here, we have what are called the terraced houses. And in order to live in this part of Ephesus, downtown, you had to be important. These were the homes of 7 wealthy Ephesians that have been excavated. Each home was 3 stories tall with its own courtyard and elaborate decorations. You can see over here these beautiful mosaic floors, incredibly finely detailed and beautifully laid out. One of the richest men in this row of 7 houses actually had not only an indoor freshwater pool, but also an indoor saltwater pool. Over here we have the Temple of Hadrian. It's one of the most photographed structures in Ephesus, and it was built before 130 AD, and it's one of the most beautiful and well-preserved structures in the city. This Corinthian-style temple originally had a wooden roof, and its main archway is supported by a keystone. It's an architectural marvel that remains perfectly balanced without any need for mortar. And the temple has stood the test of time, but Hadrian's legacy is not quite as clear. Emperor Hadrian was known as one of the 5 good Roman emperors, but he was a man of many secrets, and he appears to also have been a man of mixed sexual interests. Augustus, the great historian, criticized Hadrian's love of both good-looking young men as well as his adulteries with women. And it's believed that he also tried to poison his wife, which makes me wonder why he's considered a good emperor, and makes me wonder just how bad the bad ones really were. One of the magical things about Ephesus is that there are no modern-built structures around here. There's no visual pollution from suburbs or apartment buildings, so you can really place yourself here. It's just magical in that way. So a typical day for an Ephesian would involve a visit to the public bath. First, there was a changing room where you stripped down. Next, you came in here to a steam room to work up a sweat, and then you plunged into a cold pool or a frigidarium. And this is where you would relax and chat with your friends. The baths were much more than just washrooms. They were health clubs. They had exercising machines, swimming pools. They also had gardens for socializing, libraries, shops, bars, pedicurists, even brothels. The public baths catered to every Ephesian need. Most importantly, though, the baths offered a convivial place that was cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Ephesians could get out of their stuffy apartments and relax. Admission was virtually free, just a small coin, and locals would come every day. The tradition of public baths continues today, from Romans to Byzantines to Ottomans and to Turks. So this is a really interesting building over here. Very few Ephesians could afford private bathrooms. So most people came and took care of business at a public bathroom like this one. Come and have a look inside here. Inside we see toilets ranged side by side with no partition in between them. So visiting the loo was a social event. There were seats for a sort of rollicking poop party of about 40 people. Just think of it, 40 people all doing their business here at the same time. Above this seating area, there would have been a wooden roof, so at least it was hidden from the sun and not exposed to the sky. People who used this area sat on the toilets here. Rather than toilet paper, they actually used sponges on sticks, and you can see how this slot here accommodates the stick. Beneath those toilet seats, there ran a stream with a constant rush of water going through to carry away the waste. And down here, you can see another little channel. And this is where fresh water ran through, and that was used for washing up afterwards. The Ephesians were highly aware of the need for good hygiene because they lived very closely together. This was a densely packed area, and they understood how important it was to remain sanitary. Interestingly also, it's said that if things were chilly, if the weather was cold, high-rolling, wealthy Ephesians would send their slaves down to these public bathrooms to warm the seats for them. And when my grandfather was a youngster at boarding school in England, he had to do the same thing for the senior boys, use his tiny little rump to warm up the toilet seat for the big boys. That's a true story. And this magnificent structure is the Library of Celsus. And it epitomizes Ephesus at its peak. At the time, it was the third largest library in the ancient world, rivaled only by the libraries at Pergamum and Alexandria. It had inside 12,000 volumes. And the library was named after Celsus, a governor of this region whose son built the library as a mausoleum in his honor in 123 AD. You can see the 4 statues at the front between the columns, and they represent the traits of Celsus: wisdom, knowledge, intelligence, and bravery. It's a grand structure, but it's also an optical illusion. The outer columns are bigger than the inner columns, and that makes the structure look taller than it actually is. And as we head towards the steps, I picture this in its prime, covered in marble, light pouring in through the niches at the top that once held the scrolls. And interestingly, the earliest scrolls were made of Egyptian papyrus, which was a plant material. But the Egyptians at Alexandria didn't want this library to be bigger than their library. They were jealous, and they shortly refused to export any more papyrus to the Romans here. The Romans had to roll up their sleeves and invented a different parchment material made of dried animal skin. And that's what they wrote on, and that's how they kept their records. Just take a moment to look around in here. This was just the forecourt, really, of the library, and it extended back that way, full of these beautiful papyrus scrolls of literature, public records. So let's head out again. Now, as we descend these steps, we can see over here these 3 beautiful archways, the triple archway it's called. And these led to another section of the library where there were also lecture halls over here. And the gate is inscribed at the top with the names Mazaeus and Mithridates. These were slaves who were freed by Emperor Augustus. They became wealthy citizens who built this gate in appreciation of their liberty. Now, should the ancient scholars who spent their days in the library have found themselves in need of a break, there also just happened to be a brothel across the way, and it was connected to the library by an underground passage. The brothel seems to have been hidden. There's no sign of the structure today, but it was certainly no secret, as this advertisement over here seems to suggest. Some people have called this the world's oldest business card. And if you look closely, inscribed in the marble is an image of a heart, a woman, a foot, a hole in the ground, and a money purse. And one of the interpretations of this carving is, up at the crossroads on the left, you'll find women whose love can be purchased. But please, only stop if your foot is at least this big, young men, and you have enough coins to fill this hole. Otherwise, we kindly direct you to the library on the right. At least they suggested a more enriching experience for those who were too young to enter the brothel. So this area is called the Commercial Agora, or Lower Agora, and it housed the city's main shopping market. This square over here resembles the layout of agoras that were found across many cities in the Mediterranean, an open courtyard surrounded by columns that supported a portico to shade the businesses within the square. The central outdoor area here could accommodate around 500 different stalls, allowing for nearly 750 individual merchants to sell goods from all over the world. In fact, in some places you can actually see on the walls engravings describing what each of the shops sold. Now, the Agora today is really nothing more than piles of broken pillars and a few of these structures around here. But just imagine it in its prime, in all of its glory. Picture the marble roofs, the statues standing tall, painted with vibrant colours, and the hustle and the bustle of this market. Julius Caesar probably walked on this very path. Tragically, slaves were also sold in this market. Slavery played a central role in society and the economy here. Slaves were usually conquered, kidnapped, or captured people, prisoners of war. Children were sold by their fathers. Fathers were sold by their children, and husbands sold their wives into slavery. Besides manual labour, slaves frequently performed domestic services, but some were actually also employed in highly skilled jobs and professions. Teachers, accountants, doctors were often slaves. Those condemned to slavery as punishment worked on farms, in mines, and their living conditions were brutal. And of course, their lives were very short. When being sold, each slave in this market wore a pendant with their age, hometown, their abilities, and their disabilities. And the most important things in a slave's value was their strength, their skills, and their beauty. Of course, they were also branded on their body with a hot iron, and that brand could easily be identified if those slaves tried to escape. Astonishingly, the number of slaves in the city was actually equal to a quarter of the population. So, for example, we know that at its peak, there was 250,000 people living in Ephesus. So we can estimate that there were roughly 60,000 slaves in the city at that time. And according to ancient records, some of the noble families, the richest families, had over 200 slaves in their household. So as we approach this incline, you might start to feel your machine kick up. We'll get our blood pumping as we walk up this beautiful street. Now, there were many extraordinary people who walked these streets of Ephesus, great poets, philosophers, generals, and Caesars. But there was one man who really stood out, and that was St. Paul the Apostle, a Christian missionary and teacher. When he arrived here, Ephesus was a pagan city. The citizens worshipped the Greek goddess Artemis, who was also known to the Romans as Diana. And when Paul arrived and began preaching that Greek and Roman gods weren't really gods at all, the Ephesians were naturally outraged. Not only had Paul offended their beliefs, he was seen as a threat to the many Ephesians who made their living in the city's main cottage industry, which was manufacturing and selling small carvings and icons of the goddess Artemis. These were sold at enormous profit to the thousands of pilgrims who visited this site. The Ephesians believed that if St. Paul's Christian message took hold, people would no longer flock to Ephesus to worship Artemis, nor buy Artemis-inspired souvenirs. The loudest voice of outrage was a man named Demetrius. He was the wealthy and influential leader of the Gold and Silversmiths Guild. He gathered his fellow merchants in the great theatre, whipped them into a frenzy, saying that because of Paul, their goddess Artemis would be scorned and deprived of her majesty that brought all the world to worship her. Upon hearing this, his fellow gold and silversmiths chanted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." and the city was filled with confusion. People rushed together from the theatre and dragged with them Gaius and Aristarchus, who were Paul's travel companions. Paul wished to go into the crowd, but his disciples wouldn't let him, and then he beat a hasty retreat into the countryside outside of Ephesus, and there he wrote his famous letter to the Ephesians, which of course became a book in the New Testament. Eventually, the goddess Artemis was rejected, and Christianity became the city's official religion. So we've just entered the Ephesus Grand Theatre. As we make our way up the stairs, you're going to feel your machine incline, and if you're anything like me, you're going to feel your thighs burn. This was the most magnificent of all of the structures in Ephesus. It was used for concerts, plays, religious and philosophical discussions, and of course, gladiatorial contests. The theatre was the centre of cultural activity in the city, and I can just imagine being seated here, listening to the roar of the crowd as two gladiators down below clashed and met their fate. The Grand Theatre was constructed during the reign of Emperor Nero around 60 AD, and with a capacity of for 25,000 people, it was by far the largest amphitheatre in the ancient world. Just take a look at that view. An absolutely extraordinary piece of architecture. The acoustics in this amphitheatre are so good that even if you were one of the poor or the immigrants or the foreigners who were consigned to the very nosebleed seats at the top of the amphitheatre, you could still hear every word being said on stage. So Ephesus peaked at around 100 AD under the Romans, but as the Roman Empire fell, so fell Ephesus. The city then limped along under the wing of the Byzantine Empire, but was always plagued by a problem that had existed for hundreds of years. The harbour kept silting up, and ships struggled to access the port, and eventually trade dried up completely. By the 7th century, the harbour was closed for good, and the area became a marshland, which bred malaria and decimated the population. The survivors relocated to today's town of Seljuk, and once great Ephesus was forgotten. To give you a sense of just how much that harbour silted up, 1,500 years ago, the Aegean Sea lapped at the gates of the city. But as you look in the distance today, you notice how far away the sea is? You can't even see it. It's 3 miles distant. Centuries of silt and big city drainage have left Ephesus high and dry. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that this cultural time capsule was brought back to life, and that was thanks to the construction of a railway system from Istanbul to Baghdad. During the initial surveys, a team of international archaeologists found the Temple of Artemis, so beginning the unearthing of this wonderful city. So maybe, just maybe, Artemis didn't lose all her power after all. And that's it. You've made it to the end of the walk. Congratulations. I'm Mick Davie, your iFit guide, and I look forward to seeing you next time.